Welcome to How Does a Divided Wisconsin Move Forward? A virtual issues forum presented by the League of Women Voters of Dane County. This forum is being recorded for those who cannot be with us tonight and can be viewed later on the Dane County League's website. I'm Joy Cardine. I'm a member of the Dane County League's Program Committee, and I also serve on the Board of Directors for the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. I'll be your moderator for tonight's forum, which will be a discussion with 5 panelists on the political polarization in Wisconsin and whether the state can make any progress in bridging the rural-urban divide. What would that take? And can we come together on any issues for the greater good? And can Wisconsin heal the societal wounds and the racial disparities that have long existed, but became even more painfully pronounced in this last year? First, we will hear from each of our guest panelists from their perspectives on the seriousness of the polarization in Wisconsin, why we're divided, how this happened, and then we will focus on moving forward and what might bridge the divides. We'll talk about what needs to happen next and what actions might we all take to improve the well-being of everyone who lives in Wisconsin. I'm going to introduce our panelists and present questions to them one at a time to start, and then we're going to open it up for a wide-ranging discussion with your input too. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A section of the screen, which is usually the bottom of the screen. So type that in and I will present your thoughts, your questions, maybe your answers as we go along. We have with us tonight UW-Madison Political Science Professor Kathy Kramer, Beloit College Assistant Professor of Political Science Philip Chen, the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Farmers Union, Julie Bomar, the Executive Director of Black Leaders Organizing for Communities, or BLOC, Angela Lang, and the President and Founder of We Are Many, United Against Hate, Masood Akhtar. I'm going to start our discussion with Kathy Kramer. She is a professor of political science and the Natalie C. Holton Chair of Letters and Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is the author of the award-winning book, The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin and the Rise of Scott Walker, which brought to light the rural resentment toward cities and its implications for contemporary politics. Professor Kramer, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. It's great to talk with you, Joy, and the whole panel. And also, it's just an honor to be a part of this event for the league. Briefly, I don't mean to get off track, but on the UW-Madison campus over the past year, I've been the co-director of our Badgers Vote Coalition, which is helping students have everything they need in order to vote. And we couldn't do it without the League of Women Voters. They've just been enormously helpful, and I am just greatly indebted as a citizen and as a member of the UW-Madison faculty. I just want to thank you all.
Well, thank you, and thanks for all you do for Badger Votes too. You were one of the first persons I thought of, Kathy, when after the November election and the very close Joe Biden win in Wisconsin and his talk about uniting the country and his talk about healing the country. And I thought we talked about doing this forum. Let's do a forum on how can we heal? How can we unite? How can we move forward? And I remembered your book, and I thought we should discuss this. Before we talk about where do we go from here, though, I wanted to talk about here. How deep, how wide is the urban-rural divide in Wisconsin?
Well, it's pretty deep, unfortunately, and wide. And in my mind, the main reason is that it encompasses so many of our divides. So it's geographic, but it's also racial, it's economic, it's cultural, and it hasn't gotten smaller since my book came out. If anything, it's gotten bigger, I think.
Yeah, why is that? I mean, why do we have the divide, and why did it get bigger?
Well, it's a great question. There's many reasons and no one's entirely sure. I mean, on the one hand, you could say there's always been a rural versus urban divide in any human society, but here in Wisconsin, it's partly changes in the economy have just altered people's perception of whether they're getting their fair share, and actually their reality of their communities really struggling. But also it's our increasing racial divides, racial disparities, and unfortunately, the willingness of our leaders to make use of this divide, frankly, and to um, convince us that we are divided. And there's something to be gained by playing on people's fears of the other. And unfortunately, that has taken place in the state that we love. So there's many reasons, and I feel as though sometimes I'm only beginning to understand what has happened here.
Well, we'll talk more. Let's bring in our next panelist. Phil Chen is an assistant professor of political science at Beloit College. He studies race, ethnicity, and gender and political psychology, as well as political communication and how voters interpret and react to appeals from politicians and the media. And Kathy kind of led us right into this a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what were some of the major issues in last year's elections, the presidential election, that played into Wisconsin's political divide?
Well, I think that the way we sort of, at least the way that I sort of approach thinking about the major issues are, one, like Kathy was saying, I mean, we have to think about the way that the rural-urban split in Wisconsin is foundationally about not just sort of urban antipathy, but also about aspects of race, of culture, of all these, of economics, of all these kinds of things. And in particular, though, what we saw in 2020 was a reflection of these kinds of sort of distrust of centralized government, distrust of major urban centers, reflected in the way that the candidates talked about things, the major issues of the campaign, the COVID-19 pandemic, major racial unrest, and over police killings of people of color. I mean, these were framed. I mean, even the legitimacy of the election itself was framed in terms of rural urban splits. We look at where the Trump campaigns centered their appeals post-election, and it was in large urban centers, because it plays to that. It plays to aspects of race, and it plays to aspects of distrust, that rural resentment. And so I think those are, when we think about the way that the election was structured by and polarized, we can think in terms of sort of overarching societal divides that are mapped on to the issues of the contemporary election.
Yeah. I also wanted to have you comment on the partisan media influence on the issues in the campaign and the misinformation and disinformation that was out there. How does that influence our personal politics and the political divides in Wisconsin?
So I think what I would say is that I would flip the order there, in that I think admittedly, partisan media does sort of reinforce our existing beliefs. But more than anything, the way that we structure our media habits is driven by our partisanship. And so as much as it's partisan media reinforcing those beliefs, it's also we sort of self-select into media that is congruent with our beliefs. And the same thing happens around issues of misinformation, both because some partisan news outlets are perpetuating misinformation, but also because of what we term sort of motivated reasoning. This idea that we are motivated to confirm our prior beliefs. We think of it as accuracy motivations or directional motivations. Accuracy is we want to find the information that gives us the best answer. And it turns out that humans are really terrible at that. And we are far better at directionally motivated reasoning. We want to find information that confirms our prior beliefs, that reinforces our identity, reinforces our existing understanding of the world. And so that's where misinformation and partisan media, I think, play a really important role. We have these underlying ideological and partisan beliefs, and when misinformation, when conspiracy theories, when partisan media align with that and can reinforce those beliefs, people are quick to jump on that and adopt that information as true and real.
Next, we're going to hear from Julie Bomar, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Farmers Union, which provides statewide leadership in rural organizing and rural policy reform. Julie Bomar also leads the organization's Rural Voices Project, which tackles issues affecting rural Wisconsin farmers and communities. And Julie, I was thinking that there is an urban-rural divide in Wisconsin, as is illustrated by the red and blue counties. But there's also, just because you live in rural Wisconsin doesn't mean that you're voting red. And you're trying to bridge that divide.
Correct. I'm just so glad to be on this panel, first of all, let me say. And I'm a League of Women voter member from the Chippewa Valley.
I didn't know that.
Good, yeah, good to be with like minds. And I just also want to acknowledge the amazing work that Block has done in organizing. Angela is a real role model to all of us in the state who organize, and they really are something to watch. So glad to be here for everybody. And with everybody. Yeah, we're a big tent organization, and we've been around for a long time in Wisconsin. And by big tent, I mean, I work with everybody from socialists to libertarians, to people off the grid who voted for Trump, some who voted third party, you name it. It's a big tent. And I can tell you, it was a really windy year to have a big tent. For sure. I mean, I think Philip and Kathy have hit on a few things, but I think one thing out here is that we don't want to be thought of. I'm calling in from Chippewa Falls, okay, just so you kind of can place me tonight. We're not a monolithic group out here in rural America. And there's a lot of diversity in rural America. There's a lot of political ideologies that are present. And I think part of the rural resentment that people feel is they get typecast as all being, of a certain ideology and skin color, and that is certainly not the case. That being said, it was a big year for the divide, and so I work with a lot of folks who are very aware of political economy, and it's because they live and they breathe it every single day. And, we've lost half of our dairy farms in the state of Wisconsin since 2004. Our kids are flocking out of our little towns. There are not job centers in many places. There's not COVID beds for people in counties. There's not a hospital, at least in one of the counties where I reside. And so people are really hurting in rural America, and they don't like the status quo. And they haven't liked it for a long time through multiple administrations, and they're incredibly cynical about the status quo. And I think part of it is, certainly that there are politicians that play to the lowest common denominators, but there also is a realism out here that we're hurting and that the government isn't working for ordinary people anymore. Yeah. And so that's progressivism, is when you believe that the government should work for ordinary people. So that's kind of the sentiment in the water that I swim in.
We will get back to you and that. Next, let's go to Angela Lang, Executive Director of Black Leaders Organizing for Communities, or BLOC. She also serves as the Vice President of the ACLU of Wisconsin's Board of Directors and is a member of the Diverse and Resilient Board of Directors. Previously, she served as Political Director with For Our Future Wisconsin. So welcome, Angela. Thank you very much for being with us. Why do you think there is such a deep urban-rural divide. Angela, do you think racism is at the root of this?
I think it can be a part of it. I think going back to what Julie was saying is like not being able to typecast people. I do think that there are, I think, some misguided, I think, assumptions about people of color and communities of color. And I think a lot of times we've been kind of our communities have been pit against each other almost as a zero-sum game. Instead of, what we saw with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I think is very poignant and very, I think, telling that when people come together, there is the collective 99% versus 1% type of mentality. But oftentimes what prevents that 99% from coming together can be differences in race and just not understanding. I remember hearing in 2016, some white folks say, I don't agree with, Trump's racist stuff, but I agree with this policy, or I agree with that economic policy, or I just think he's a good business person. And there's a point of privilege there to be able to put aside a lot of the issues of racism and white supremacy and how that manifests in our community to say, you know what, I can choose to ignore this and vote for a candidate whose other policies I believe in, even though a lot of his racist rhetoric and policies directly impacted communities of color. And so I think it's important to understand kind of history and how that this has been a trend. As frustrating as it is now, I always think it's important to be able to figure out the why, and instead of just trying to vilify people off the bat, but really understand that constant messages in our communities and kind of this anti-status quo sentiment we've seen. And I had a conversation recently, earlier today, with a colleague, that 2016 was basically, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump to a certain point. And they were, the reason that both of those candidates were widely popular is because they were kind of anti-establishment. And when you feel that you have been left behind in the establishment, you're going to gravitate towards a candidate that is speaking to you. But obviously, we know the differences between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and how they spoke to those respective parties. But I feel like at the end of the day, those groups were looking for similar things. So I think, part of it, absolutely, we cannot negate that white supremacy is so pervasive in every fabric of every fiber of our country. But we also want to make sure that we are not just automatically vilifying, rural folks, because as was mentioned, all of our communities, we're not a monolith and we're not homogenous, and we need to be able to kind of just peel back the layers and really understand and get to that core of why.
Let me move next to Masood Akhtar, president and founder of We Are Many United Against Hate, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization with a mission for fighting hate, bigotry, and racism. The group recently announced that 3 Wisconsin high schools and UW-Stevens Point have launched chapters of We Are Many United Against Hate. And that's one of the reasons, Masood, that I wanted you to be on this panel. You had written in, or you had said in an article I read about this, that you don't see a red wave or a blue wave, you see a youth wave when it comes to changing the conversation, I guess, that you see young people getting involved in groups like yours are the answer, that's the answer to ending hate, bigotry, and racism. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, thank you, Joy, for inviting me, and I really appreciate all the work that you do. And also, the League of Women Voters have been involved into this. So that's excellent. I really appreciate that. Yeah, to me, we were earlier talking about the rural-urban divide. This divide existed before, but it got to the next level under Donald Trump administration because, the environment of fear and anger and confusion was really created as a result of that. Me, even myself, part of the Muslim community, I felt during the entire administration that we were labeled as terrorists. I mean, that's the reason why we started this movement of We Are Many United Against Hate, because I was just fearful this is going to be a White House and all the minorities be around that. So I wanted to bring all of these people together. But the movement really is very much based into what is happening in this country, what is causing this, hate in all of these campuses and you name it, everywhere, for the State Department, federal, and what's going on. And to me, the most important thing was to do a grassroots approach. And one way to do that is empower these youth in high schools, middle schools, and colleges to actively involve into these kinds of activities and understand what is causing this and come up with solutions. So one of the ways we created what I call the Students Ambassador Board. The 2 or 4 students are participating on that. Now they're getting to the extent that they started chapters of We Are Men United Against Hate. The idea behind it, that this will be driven by these youth, and they're going to create what I call a village where they live. So schools, teachers, administrators, business people, parents, elected officials of their parties are going to be involved into, and they will all be working together. And this is the way it will become a nonpartisan issue. We're going to engage leaders of both parties, and then we'll just work together to understand what's causing it and fix those problems and bring some educational program to schools to address those concerns and bring this country back to where it was before.
I'm going to move back to Kathy, and forgive me, I'm going to use first names. That's easier as we discuss. You after you wrote the book, The Politics of Resentment, you did get involved in a new project that was going to bring people together. At least, tell us about the Local Voices Network.
Sure, I'd love to. So it just was just a very fortunate circumstance where I met a man who's a researcher at the MIT Media Lab, and we had very shared concerns over the nature of our divides and the nature of our communication here in the United States. And so together and with a whole team of people, we created this thing called the Local Voices Network that is intended to bring small groups of people together to talk about their hopes and concerns, and then for people in their community and across the country to be able to listen to their voices, and for journalists as well as public officials to listen to their voices as well. And so the idea was there's so many people feeling unheard in the United States right now. It kind of goes back to something Julie said, where there's this pervasive sense that the system as it is not working for the vast majority of people. And so there's really a hunger for people to talk about their concerns, to express their concerns, and to have their concerns heard by both their fellow community members as well as journalists and policymakers who can do something about it. And there also is just a very strong desire among many of us to heal some of these divides, to try to understand each other. And currently, our ways of listening to one another are, the incentives are not to listen. They're to be provocative and to shout and to be divisive. And so we have tried to create this thing, which fortunately, now I'm just an analyst. I'm no longer a community organizer or organizing the conversations. We have 2 people here in Wisconsin, Colleen Butler and Matias Lemus Castillo, who are running the conversations in Wisconsin, as well as helping to get conversations in other parts of the country off the ground. So we, in the last few years, have started chapters in New York City, in Boston, in Birmingham, Alabama, and now with the pandemic, originally, these are all in-person conversations, but they've all gone online to Zoom, which in many ways has been fortuitous because it's been able to have lots of people connect with one another through these conversations. And the last thing I'll say is it's very hopeful to me because, for one thing, probably people listening in and everybody on this panel knows this experience of when somebody asks you what you think and you have an opportunity to actually share your concerns with other people. It feels really good. Like, we don't have a whole lot of opportunities to do that. And so people appreciate sharing their stories, and people have been listening to these stories. So one of my favorite examples is here in Madison. The Local Voices Network was used to help bring community voices into the hiring of our new police chief process. So I think it's making a difference. So it is a source of hope for me.
Julie, the Farmers Union, you shared a video with me, and we did, by the way, put that on the Dane County League's website. And it's called Deep Canvassing, but it was rural people reaching out to other rural people to reach some common ground. Tell us about that effort.
Yeah, that's certainly a technique of organizing. It's just really listen to people and make a connection based on values and people's personal storytelling. And we're doing much more of that over the course of the next few years. It's deep listening as well as really personal storytelling and giving people an opportunity to express themselves. It's also neighbor to neighbor, having people in rural areas reach out to each other. We've also tried to reach a lot across some of the race, class, and space divides with another effort, a farmer labor solidarity effort that we've been running, where we connect with groups like Angela's, as well as many labor unions, and really trying to find that common ground of economic justice, really primarily, and trying to solidify those commonalities that we have across those divides. Those are a couple projects. We've got a lot more going on too, but those are two I'd like to highlight.
Yeah. Angela, I read a recent piece, I think it was perhaps shortly after Joe Biden was inaugurated, and you were talking about feeling a little bit more hopeful about the future, but that still a lot of change is needed. Talk some about whether you think Joe Biden will be able to unite the country and what that will entail.
Yeah, I think Joe Biden has a serious challenge on his hands. I've said this long before the November election, is that white supremacy is going to exist long after the November election, no matter who is elected. And it existed long before 2016. And so I think it's going to take more than a new administration to heal that. It's also not fallen by the wayside on me to know that the day before January 6th happened in our nation's capital was also the day before was when Georgia flipped blue, for the first time in forever, if ever, and it seemed like we didn't get a chance to celebrate the collective power of Black folks because there's this visceral reaction to when communities of color, not just Black folks, but communities of color start to advance in society. And we also know that the day before, it was interesting to see the events play out of January 6th, understanding the day before the DA in Kenosha chose not to press charges in the attempted murder of Jacob Blake in Kenosha because Jacob Blake was seen as a threat. But literally the next day, we have, insurrectionists storming the Capitol, largely that don't look like us. We can compare what the Black Lives Matter protests were met with. And so we see a lot of the divide, as Kathy was mentioning. I think the divide has gotten a lot bigger and a lot deeper. And I think sometimes it's hard to relate and to have conversations and move forward when people's opinions are not just simply disagreements. Disagreements is, do you take your coffee black or with cream? That's a disagreement. A disagreement shouldn't be, do you believe that my existence as a 31-year-old pansexual millennial should not exist? So sometimes it's hard to find that common ground when people's values are rooted in constantly oppressing or even eliminating your identity. And so I'm encouraged, but I also am not naive to know and understand that this is going to be a long uphill battle and a long challenge that I think is going to, outlast President Biden and is going to happen for the next several decades, I believe, to truly heal from where we're at in this current moment.
Yeah, we are getting some questions from our attendees, and again, you can type a question in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. That's where I'll be monitoring mostly. I do see there is one for Julie in particular. Could you elaborate what rural communities would like to see happen? I am sure there are a lot of great ideas, especially as many don't expect or want big government to solve their problems. So what rural communities would like to see happen?
Well, I can really speak on behalf of the 2,000 plus family members and our organization. We're the second largest ag organization in the state of Wisconsin. And this is our policy book. It's filled with stuff from rural hospitals to what people want and what farmers want in the Farm Bill to wolf control to voting rights. And so it's chock full of ideas. I think the person who posed the question is right, though. I mean, a lot of farmers in particular and rural people in general don't want handouts from the government. They want to have self-determination. They want to have a livelihood that works, that preserves a way of life. And they see that deteriorating rapidly. And so they are hard workers and they want to earn a living, but that's no different than the vast majority of people in the United States. And I think that we should be able to get together on those grounds. But I would say there are a lot of progressives in rural areas, but they're not really fond of progressives. And so that can be a real challenge.
A question for Kathy. Democrats frustrated with the urban-rural divide often question why rural white voters vote against their own economic interests by supporting Republicans. In her book, Cast, Isabel Wilkerson had a very different perspective, arguing that rural whites are voting for their long-term economic interests by supporting Republicans because these voters are most interested in preserving their white privilege, and Republicans support that interest. Do you agree with that?
Well, that is a great question. And the first thing that comes to mind is just, I think it's really important for all white folks to contemplate to what extent perpetuating white privilege is in our interests, and to what extent we're doing it just individually and collectively in order to maintain our privilege. So I'm reluctant to pin that on rural folks in particular, but I guess I'll answer the question in a slightly different way, and that is to say, it's for a lot of us. I mean, the extent of economic inequality in this country is just so blatant and stark now, having lived through this pandemic. And in addition to working on this Local Voices Network, the place my attention has turned to is to this economic equality and the roots of it. And I know from my colleagues who study economic equality around the world and can kind of compare across countries that the extent of our economic inequality in the United States is significant and pretty extraordinary. But our income inequality isn't necessarily out of step with other countries, but what is out of step is our lack of redistribution. So compared to other countries around the world, our government does far less to redistribute resources so that people who have a whole lot are doing something to help those who are really in need. And the answer that people keep coming back to for why that is the case is basically racism. And it's because in the United States, among the people who are at the bottom third of the income earners, they're disproportionately people of color. And it appears to interrupt the willingness of other people in the top two income thirds from wanting to give up their money and also their power. So I realize I'm not answering your question directly, Jim. But the way I'm trying to answer it these days is to get us all to look at how the system as it currently operates is really not working for the vast majority of people. And the thing that seems to be preventing it is racism.
Oh, Phil, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I'm not to disagree with Kathy at all. I think that's right on. And I think, but I would be remiss to not say that I think part of it is also driven by what we've seen for decades of political rhetoric that has been designed to create this this sense of racial division over economic issues. We can look to Marty Gillins's book, Why Americans Hate Welfare, that looks at the way that welfare has been racialized, both in media accounts and therefore, and how that's translated into the public's sort of reaction to that. Joe Sauce, who's a UW graduate, him and Richard Fording and Sanford Schramm have Disciplining the Poor, which is about sort of the racialization of the implementation of welfare programs. But the thing to remember, I think that we so often miss is that when redistribution happens, the most visible and political forms of redistribution are heavily racialized, and the ones that kind of sort of fly under the radar, what Suzanne Mettler terms as submerged state, are the ones that are often racialized white or not, or are seen as sort of less racial programs, things. So we have good evidence that something like Social Security is racialized white in public opinion. And so, it absolutely is about the dynamics of poverty and inequality in the US, but it's also about the way that political actors have used that and used the rhetoric around redistributive programs for their own sort of political gain.
Yeah. Masood, at the beginning of this year, excuse me, you wrote a piece that was let's unite. Let's all make a pledge to unite. Given what we're hearing right now, it's not going to be easy, is it?
You know, I am a very optimistic person, originally from India. So I love this country, and I know things happen in this country that don't happen in other countries. So I'm a strong believer in this. The important thing is, what is our strategy? You know, we need to be proactive rather than reactive. And we need to be nonpartisan in terms of our strategies. You know, I just want to say one thing, that I was talking to one of our advisory board member who is a former white supremacist, the guy who started the largest hate group and killed these 6 people, Sikh temple shooting in 2012. I was having lunch with him. And I asked him a couple questions. How did you recruit people to kill people? And I thought that was the most toughest job that you could ever have. And he said, no, you know, economic insecurity is a breeding ground for hate and a recruiting tool for these hate groups. There are 15 hate groups right now operating just in Wisconsin. So when we talk about economic insecurity, urban-rural divide, that plays into it. So the important thing is that, you know, understanding what is causing, as we talked about before, and coming up with some solutions to that. One of the things that we are doing at We Are Many United Against Hate at a small level is education. Our intent is to reach out to all of these people from low and medium income families and make sure they go for higher education. So we are creating a $2 million interest-free loan that will be tied up with their jobs. We are creating a list of mentorships with different fields of specialization. But here is a point, that if you are a white guy and you want to become a mechanical engineer, you're going to get a mechanical engineer mentor, but that person will be Black, Muslim, a minority. The idea is that if these 2 guys will start working together over the next 2 to 4 years, if they're going for a 2-year associate or a 4-year, think about the impact that this would have. That person of color change the life of a white person, or the other way around. And also some of these people have to understand the civic. I tell you all the time, I get so many phone calls from some of my own nieces. They say, we are sharing these rooms with people who are born in this country, and we know a heck of a lot about the US Constitution and how this country was built. So there is a piece to that where we need to start educating people. I am optimistic that if we are going to work together, engaging white people, because they have to come out and be part of this exercise, we're going to make it happen. And the way to do that is, one of my thought is create in Wisconsin a Wisconsin bipartisan unity caucus that is led by elected officials of both parties. And then we all actively participate to make those changes, and also do similar things at a national level, to do a national bipartisan unity caucus, and then start putting together educational piece and also some of these nonpartisan policies to make it happen. So I'm optimistic. I think we can do it.
We have a question. We talk about race a lot, but we usually don't talk about our native nations. Where do these people fit in the picture? Well, we certainly have a number of native nations in Wisconsin, and a lot in northern Wisconsin. Julie, is that our native, are the tribes in the reservations in northern Wisconsin involved in your various rural voices?
Not as much as we would like, for sure. And that is definitely part of the outreach effort and in-reach effort, I would say, really trying to uplift the work that they're doing. I would say that, food sovereignty is a huge issue that we can certainly get together on, and protecting land. And we all know that agriculture in the United States is based on the pillaging of indigenous land, and acknowledging that, first of all, is a first step, I think. And we did that this year at our convention in our preamble, to acknowledge that agriculture in the United States has really been built on the backs and the unfortunate history of enslavement, as well as stealing of indigenous lands, which I think was a big step for our members to do. I would like to acknowledge that Native nations across this United States were very pivotal in this election, and we saw some amazing rural organizing going on in Utah and in Arizona. That really flipped, a lot of counties around. And so the activism coming out of tribal country is really something that we should all be paying attention to. It's amazing.
One of our attendees says, in my reading, I came across this thought that minority gains of privilege and rights and wealth is viewed as a threat to the traditional privileged white male. The view is their gain lessens our status. Has this view been discussed, and has there been any thought on changing this view? Well, Phil, you wanna tackle that one first, in terms of is it mainly the white rural male who is at the heart of the rural urban divide? Is that the fear of the white rural male?
I don't think, I guess from a messaging standpoint, sometimes that's, I think, the way it's framed. But I think the idea of what we would term a zero-sum racial game is not nearly, it's not really about, it's much less about, I think, rural urban splits. And I think in my mind, it's, and what we see in a lot of the literature, there's good research coming out from, I think it was in one of the behavioral science journals, and a number of other journals have shown that as ideas around as diversity in the U.S. increases, this idea has become more prevalent among certain groups of white people that gain the exact thought that gains for racial minorities are by definition sort of a reduction in in goods or services for white people, when we know that's not true, when we know that's not the case. I think Ashley Jardina's work on white identity politics touches on this. It seems more tied to particular views of white identity and especially white consciousness than it is about urban-rural divides. So I'm sort of dancing around the question a little bit, other than to say, I don't know that anyone that I've seen has come up with a good way to sort of overcome this view. But I think the first step in a lot of academic work is finding out what is sort of underlying these perceptions of zero-sum racial games. And I think what we're seeing is that may be driven both by sort of societal changes as well as perceptions of whiteness, white identity, in-group affinity. And that's one of the big points of Jardina is that white identity is really about in-group affinity rather than out-group hostility. And there is some really good research. I have some stuff coming out that shows that white identity works very separately from racial hostility. And so I think there's a lot of work. It's a pretty new sort of area of research, not the idea of a zero-sum racial game, but the research that's trying to pin the sort of the underlying aspects of that is I think coming out fairly recently, although I may be missing something that I just sort of forgot about at this point.
That's all right. I should probably get to more of our common ground portion of the panel. Kathy, are there issues that you believe we can find common ground on in Wisconsin in particular, given how divided we are? Are there things that we can agree on?
I think there are, but I would say my greatest hope lies not in issues, but in just the way we want to be treated as humans. And that I think the greatest one of the greatest potential common grounds in Wisconsin is it's not exclusive to Wisconsin, but is this desire to just be respected, right? Respected by your political leaders and respected by your fellow residents. And for so many people, when we make our political decisions, primarily in the voting booth, it's not issues that are driving our choices, but instead our sense of who we are and who we are not. And unfortunately, these days, it's a very divisive tune, us versus them. But there are so many other ways that can be fostered, right? Our sense of, are we proud? Like, what kind of place are we proud to be a part of? And it's that kind of thing where my mind goes these days when I think of common ground, like how it's not necessarily the case that politics has to be zero sum, right? So many of the things we've talked about tonight, like if we treat people in general better, we're all better off, right? That isn't a zero sum game. There is enough to go around. There is more than enough in this state and in this country and in this world to go around. And that, I think there's a common ground in that we need to grasp, and the issues will come later. It's a mindset. It's like, where did we learn that we're going to be better off by hating other people? How did, and I do think, to go back to some of the things Philip was saying earlier, like we're taught this stuff, right? It's in someone's interest for us to behave this way. But my experience is so many people don't want to live that way, right? We can find a different way. So issues I think are secondary to like a mindset of who do we want to be as a people.
Yeah. Masood, you have your new UW-Stevens Point chapter, my alma mater, by the way, a small college town in rural Wisconsin. And one of your chapter leaders is a person of color. I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he, how is he, what kind of, I don't know, what kind of success is he having in reaching out?
Yeah, I think we put together a very strategical approach on that campus. So when we created this, there was a requirement that I always see whenever there is a campus, whether it is school or college, people always introduce to say 95% of people are white. And then you go into this panel conversation and you see all the panelists, there is no white. And so I started raising this question as a part of requirement. When they create something, white people, the students, and other people have to be involved as a part of the team, because without their support, not much is going to happen. So all of these students that we talk once a month, and their principal of the school and other teachers involved into this, we get into those kinds of conversations that everybody is involved when we talk about all the issues that, some of those we already talked about. Kathy mentioned, people are taught to hate. And I strongly believe that if people can be taught to hate, we can teach them how to love. And the only way you can do that when you engage, sit down with them, talk with them. Like myself, the biggest threat, you talked about media, the biggest threat to the minority community safety issue is that, if you have a Muslim who is a shooter, what do you see in the media and elected official? Terrorist, Muslim terrorist, Islamic terrorist. Now you are associated this action with religion. When the person is not a Muslim and he does the same action, you don't hear those kinds of words quite often about terrorism and religion and those kinds. That's a double standard of our policies that we need to work on. So when we are working with these students, we are working with them as creating an environment that is acceptable to everybody. And if there is some kind of issue, then we bring the best practices actually to address it. So I think that, this kind of approach is looking pretty attractive, and we're going to continue working on it and build the kind of structure that we want to build on each of these campuses.
Masood, you might have some thoughts on this question. In watching the recent state boys basketball tournament, I was struck at the lack of minorities on most teams. I question why there would not have been more involvement by minorities in rural areas. Possibly Masood may have some thoughts on changing this. So she must be seeing teams from rural Wisconsin, and they're all white teams.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is something a part of education. We need to engage ourselves. We need to participate in those kinds of activities and bring all the communities together. There will be some differences depending upon where this community is located. And I think that to me is very, very critical. That's what I always talk about. Every single thing that we do, we have to think about that. We have to be very strategic. Always remember that when you engage with people, then hate started disappearing. I started believing it. I have seen it in my own cases. I do get a lot of hate letters from these people and all sorts of things. My garage was painted, everything, but my response to these people have been very simple. You're acting because you don't understand what Islam is or Muslim is. You want to sit down and talk about it. So that is a central piece of sitting down with people and talking about each other. And I think things are going to change. And I want to change it from the bottom up in terms of, engaging this youth at early stage. I can tell you on my board, I have 5 or 6 former white supremacists, white nationalists, neo-Nazis. Even one of them is Al-Qaeda, former Al-Qaeda leader, or recruited from here. And it is very clear to me, after talking to these people, that how they reach out to these kids and other people to recruit people. And that to me is very alarming. So I'm developing some curriculum with the help of those people who lived that life, because they know what works, what doesn't work. Now their life is completely changed. So we're going to bring some of those things to these schools and state departments and federal agencies, so as the businesses as well. Now businesses are reaching out to us as well because they want to develop their equity inclusion plan as well. So Education engagement is so critical, and that's what we need to focus on.
If I could jump in and add to that as well, I think, like specifically when we're talking about communities of color, and I stray personally away from the term of like minorities because I feel like it's very reductive. If we're trying to get people to view people as people, there's nothing minor about us. We are marginalized and we're people of color. But I think what's important to note is that we can encourage people to get involved, but if the culture is not supportive, people are not going to get involved. I can't imagine Native American folks want to get involved for a basketball team whose mascot is the Redskins, right? We need to understand that there's other typical barriers of why people don't want to get involved in sports. I've heard horror stories of when Black basketball players walk onto the court being called the N-word by their rival and their opposing team. And so why would students put themselves through that? And I also think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up. I think we're talking a lot about race, but also other ways and people are marginalized. Republicans just announced last week that they're going to be introducing, either they did or will be introducing an anti-trans bill, essentially, where trans students have to choose, do they play in the sport of which they identify with, or do they have to suffer? And if they want to play that sport, go to the biological aspect of themselves, really making the difference between understanding your gender identity and expression and how that limits your sports. And so again, if we're constantly showing people that this is not a supportive culture and climate for you, simply throwing people into that climate is actually not going to change it. It's actually going to do a lot of harm because we're throwing people into these climates where we haven't done the work to actually shift the climate to make it easier for folks to participate.
That reminded me when you said of the Republicans introduced that bill, they also have introduced a bill, or they want to anyway, honor conservative talk show host Rush Limbaugh when they did not want to pass a proposal honoring Black History Month and some specific African Americans that they didn't think should be honored in this bill. And I think, Phil, why don't you handle this one in that this is a wedge issue, right? I mean, why would Wisconsin's legislature want to honor Rush Limbaugh?
I mean, I think it's not so much a wedge issue. I mean, it's a relatively it's a minor bill, right? It's not going to be a driving force in any coming election. It's partisan signaling, in my mind. It's a way to say to your base, this is who we are. This is what we care about. This is so. It's a to me. I don't think we're going to hear about that other than in fundraising appeals in the next election. It's not going to be the defining issue, but it is absolutely, I think, there to be sort of that a signal, what we think of as sort of symbolic, as a symbolic legislation as opposed to substantive in any sort of way.
I wanted to get to more of the issues where we might be able to make some progress in this year. There are some issues apparently in the proposed state budget, including broadband and a few others that we might be able to find common ground on. And I wondered, Julie, if you wanted to, talk about some of those issues that you think might actually pass.
Yeah, I do think broadband is an issue. It's still affecting about 24% of rural residents don't have access to good internet. 60% of rural Native American communities don't have access to broadband in the state. So it's like rural electrification was. You got to get to the last mile, right? And right now we really need to do that. And that is a topic I think that could have bipartisan support in Wisconsin. Nationally, I think that antitrust actually is an issue that some party is going to be claiming. And because definitely, we know that the increased or the lack of competition and increased monopolization is affecting people in all kinds of sectors. It is when we talk about economic inequality, and corporate executives and shareholders make thousands and thousands of dollars off exploited food processing workers as well as farmers. That should be an issue that we can come together on. When our bookstores are dying, our cafes are dying, and all kinds of small business doesn't play on a level playing field with corporations. I think that this is an area that many people in rural areas as well as urban areas could get behind. And we definitely see that from our analysis. So as terms of issue-based campaigning, I think that those are a couple that we can rally around. But I agree with Kathy, values and the way that we treat one another should never stop us from communicating. And that really does need to be our first foot out the door.
Yeah.
Can I chime in and ask a question actually of Angela, which is that I'm wondering that what we also know is that something like broadband access is also a key driver of inequality within Black communities. We know that Black communities are more likely to access the internet using cell phones or wireless or 5G services or internet services like that, as opposed to broadband. And so what I worry is that this framing around expanding rural broadband may actually play into that sort of rural urban divide, when what it really is an issue of economic equity.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I'm glad that we keep talking about values, because I think that is how you bring people together, is to be able to unite around common values. Like, everyone wants quality education for their kids. Everyone wants to live safe. Now, we have different perspectives of what safety is, and we have different perspectives of quality education. But what I'm always really interested in, I think there is a way to talk about an issue and talk about how it intersects with a lot of different communities. And so I think about our team when we made the shift. We're coming up on almost 1 year anniversary where we made the shift virtual, and everyone had to suddenly learn Zoom and learn things like Hustle and virtual phone banks. And most of our folks to this day are still using them on their phones because they don't have the laptops to use them. And it was definitely a learning curve. And there's times that we'll have our Zoom meetings and people keep cutting out because they also have internet connectivity issues. There's a lot of internet connectivity issues here in the city that I don't think we talk about a lot because it's framed as like broadband is like a rural thing. And so I think we need to take a step back and talk about, there's so many different issues that if we just tweak our framing a little bit can really resonate with so many different communities. We could talk about healthcare and access to healthcare, but we can also talk about Black infant mortality rates specifically as it relates to our community. But the broader value is having quality healthcare. And so I think it's important to kind of tease out the specificities. It's been a long day of of our issues and being able to name those things. I think once we talk about issues in a broad sense, people don't feel that they're connected to it. And keeping with the idea of healthcare is that if people don't even have basic access to healthcare, how are we talking about one thing or another, or talking about one specific aspect when people don't even have access to it? And so I think that there is a way and there's a lens and a perspective of how we frame our messaging. But I want to caution and not have us go and say, okay, for every community, you have your own tailored message. Like if you go up north, you got to have your message to your farmers. You go over here, you got to have your message to your hunters. And over here, you can talk about Black Lives Matter. You can only talk about that in Madison and Milwaukee, right? Like, how are we finding ways to have specific messaging so people feel that they're reflected in the campaigns or in the issues, but also there's a learning opportunity where, and Julie and I have talked about this, how do we get folks up north to talk about Black Lives Matter? How do we get folks down here to talk about, the struggles that the farmers are going through without having to change our message. And I think that goes back to this idea of the zero-sum game. We can have these broader conversations. We can see ourselves reflected in these narratives and these communications and these issues. But there's also a moment where we can do this kind of inter-community type of conversation so people can understand what all communities are going through as it relates to that specific issue as well.
There is the issue of redistricting reform that I wanted to bring up, and I'm pretty sure Julie has some things to say about this. This is an issue where all sorts of rural counties have passed referendum that call for redistricting reform, call for an independent commission to redraw legislative boundaries. And the polls show, I don't know, 70% of the state favors this, but the Republicans who do control the legislature are not ready to give up that power. Talk a little bit about, that's an issue that the people agree on, but maybe not their state legislators.
Well, you got that right. There's a lot of fire in the belly and the farmers union against gerrymandering, and it's one of the biggest obstacles we all face across the state to getting anything done. So we can come up with the best, most agreed upon policies, but if the system is completely pre-structured for those in elected offices and not for those who are in the community, then we're going to have a real problem passing anything. I think, gerrymandering, people sometimes don't understand it. And I gotta say, even it's a little wonky for some folks, right? But when you get into it, I mean, you really understand that your vote doesn't count as much, and that people don't like that. And no matter what party they belong to. And so I think we just have to have people power here. We got to organize the hell out of this. And that means the only thing that we have, since we have big barricades around our regions, is we have to have people power. And this is certainly one area that we can come together, no matter race, class, space. In Wisconsin, I mean, we're one of the most extremely anti-democratic institutions in the world because of gerrymandering. So tell people about it and why it's wrong, and get out there and organize.
Yeah, I should mention that the People's Maps Commission has been conducting public hearings in all of Wisconsin's congressional districts over the past several months, hearing from citizens about this issue. The last public hearing, the last virtual public hearing, is coming up on Thursday, March 11th at 5:30 p.m. It is for Wisconsin's 2nd Congressional District, which covers Madison and Dane County and South Central Wisconsin. But anybody, the people in the 2nd Congressional District, I think, will be the testifiers, but for the most part, but anybody can join this. You can get more information and sign up to testify at the People's Maps Commission's website. The League of Women Voters is in favor of ending gerrymandering as well. Well, we're almost we're at the time where we probably should talk more about where does divided Wisconsin move forward, and maybe I'd like to get some comments from all of you as to what happens next, or maybe what we can do as individuals to help Wisconsin move forward and to reach that common ground. Kathy, how does a divided Wisconsin move forward?
Well, I wish I knew for sure, but I'd say two things come to mind. And one is that there's so many people who care about this state and the state of affairs. And if we each could act in our individual lives in a way that we want to be treated, and we want to live in if we can act in the way that we want people to treat each other in our ideal kind of Wisconsin, that's one step forward. But also organize, Angela, Julie, Masood, get in contact with these people and ask them what they need. And because we have to do everything we can in our individual lives, but also it's going to take some concerted organized effort on behalf of people at the grassroots.
So what do you think? What's next?
Well, I don't want to be the sort of the downer in the group, but my worry or my read of the evidence is that I think Kathy's right. There's power that the voters have power, that organizing with some of these, with the groups that are wonderfully represented here today is important. But if we look at the roots of political polarization, it also traces back to the way that elites are organized and political elites and those in power operate. And so much of that, if you look at Gabe Lenz's work, is about individuals following what party leaders say, as opposed to we often think of representation as voters say we want this, right? We want fair maps, and then the people follow. When in fact, what we really see is that when elites put out a policy position, people change their policy positions to match those of their preferred party. And I think we see the same thing with polarization. And so I think we have to come to the point where elites have a vested interest in breaking the polarization that is driven politics for the last 3 or 4 decades. I'm not sure we have that yet. I don't know what that incentive is that will incentivize both Democrats and Republicans to work towards that. We missed a chance, I think, with the coronavirus pandemic. We know that national sort of nationally unifying events tend to be points at which polarization decreases. Sometimes it rebounds, something like the Iraq War. So I don't want to be negative here, but I think we also have to look to elites, and that we need elites to play a role too. And I'm not sure I've seen that happening at the national or the state level.
Angela, how does a divided Wisconsin move forward?
I think for starters, and this is going to sound strange to say, sometimes we have to quit with the Midwest nice. I've had conversations with friends that live here now and talk about how we sometimes just ignore the issues of race because we just don't want to talk about it. We tend to sweep them under the rug. And if we really want to understand how pervasive white supremacy is in all aspects of all of our institutions, we can have individual conversations as much as we want, but if we're not changing institutions because people don't fully understand how white supremacy is playing in our institutions, we're not going to get very far. And so, the first step to actually tackling a problem is to admit it exists. And I think at the bare minimum, there are some people that don't understand how white supremacy has dominated our culture and has been the dominant culture for so long. And also understanding that our society is built upon so many different ways that it's easy to perpetuate white supremacy culture. Everyone can, because it's been the dominant kind of narrative for a while. And so it takes a while to understand your personal role in perpetuating white supremacy culture, and then subsequently having the tools and the education to dismantle it and to work on that and to do the work. It's not enough to not be racist. Like, you have to be actively anti-racist and to do that work. And I'm not sure if everyone is there yet, but I think it starts by deeply reflecting on what we've all collectively experienced in this last year, whether it is the racial reckonings or really just the intersection of trauma and pain that we've really seen exacerbated through the pandemic. A lot of the issues that we're facing now structurally have existed before, but have just been magnified because of the pandemic. And so how are we, understanding more broadly what it means to center ourselves in our values of we want everyone to be safe. We want everyone to live a long, healthy life, but we also really need to understand the barriers to achieving those values. And a lot of times it's slowly trying to unravel, the white supremacy institutions. And it's hard, but I think being able to be open-minded, being open to doing the work, being open to understanding your role, all of that is incredibly difficult because people take it as a personal defensive attack. And so I encourage folks that are listening and want to continue to move forward is to continue doing that work. When someone says, hey, we don't say this term, or, your comment is a little problematic and here's why, not to meet it with, great defensiveness, but to be like, okay, I understand, let me do some research and move on and do better in the future. But I think so many times when we have these broad conversations, people internalize it so personally that we can't even focus on how this is pervasive in our institutions. If people are stuck on, well, this person thinks I'm racist because I said this word, and I'm no longer going to work on these issues anymore. I've heard people say that. People have said, I was a supporter of Black Lives Matter, but so and so happened, and I no longer support you all. There's some challenges there, and so really understanding what it means to just do the work. And I'll end by giving a plug to a dear friend of mine, is Rebecca Lynch. She's working on a race class narrative project that I think honestly gets to the core of a lot of the issues that we're talking about this evening, focusing on values and really trying to have these, these conversations in a multiracial, economic class type of way. And so I think there's going to be a lot of ways that people can fold into and plug into that work, and also use, race class narrative, tools and messaging to even have conversations individually on an individual interpersonal level with people in their own communities as well.
Thank you. Julie, how does a divided Wisconsin move forward from your perspective?
Well, I really agree with a lot of the folks here around the virtual table tonight. I mean, we really have to hold the difficult conversations, and coming from a predominantly white organization, speaking here tonight, I can tell you that these conversations are indeed personal to people, and sometimes they will completely shut down, and you just have to keep pushing forward and having them. And just listen. We don't know what each other's self-interest really is. That doesn't come off Facebook or from what you read in an article. I mean, that comes from real conversations with people. And whether that's in the north side, like we said, Angela, to the north woods, right? I mean, we need to have that real deep listening occur. And I can, because beaming in from Chippewa Falls, I can say that the rest of the state often thinks of Madison as very Madison-centric. And outstate doesn't mean, outside the borders of Madison. It means in little tiny Holcomb and Hawkins and all these places across the state where kids gather. And, we have the same problems in some of our little poor towns up here that we do in Milwaukee, where you have 80% free and reduced lunch in schools. And we need to hold these conversations across these divides and talk about what's in the interests of young people. And I'm really glad that Masood mentioned this tonight, because I think that's something that can pull us together. I'm more hopeful in some ways about the next generation than I am about the current adult generations. But I would just say we really have to ramp it up, and it shouldn't come right before the election. We need to be hustling all the time. And what I think Angela and I probably have both seen is that there's a lot of support that can come in around September 29th. That's when you usually start to see it come. But we need to be working all the time, paying people in our own backyards and neighborhoods to get together and work. And that's where the support needs to be. As a community organizer type, that's what I would call for.
Masood, do you get the last word in terms of this final question on how does a divided Wisconsin move forward?
I think first of all, we have to recognize that we are divided, and we are divided deeply. And I think once we have that, then we need to work up and try to figure this out those kinds of issues that we just talked about today. To me personally, I gave up my Indian citizenship 25 years ago because of what this country offers. People who are born in this country sometimes may not recognize that. And I think that's very important. People should not take this for granted. And that's where we all have to come together to do that. To me personally, January 6th was a wake-up call about what we notice and what extent people who are born in this country can go to that extent. So I'm just very worried about this rise in white nationalism and white supremacy and all of these things that are happening around. And we need to dig into this deeper, reach out to our elected officials and say, hey, both of your party's people should at least come out and condemn these kinds of things that happen rather than supporting it or not saying anything. That is, it starts bothering me that why is that? So there's a lot of educational part that we need to really work on it. And I think if we do that, then I strongly believe that we can change things and bring these people together and make sure that Wisconsin remains united, so as United States.
Well, thank you all very much for being with us. And I went overtime. Thank you for staying. I really appreciate it. We are going to, we're going to have to call an end to this discussion because we have a special award that we need to present. Joining us on video with this special award presentation is the president of the League of Women Voters of Dane County, Chris Clements. So, Chris, we're not hearing your audio, and I think that means you need to be clicking share audio on your. So I don't know if that's going to work, unfortunately. That's too bad.
Yep, here we go.
Okay.
At this time, I would like to present the Outstanding Voter Service Award. This award is given annually to a community member or organization who has demonstrated extraordinary commitment to voter outreach. This year, it is my privilege to present this award to Julia Pooler. Julia Pooler is a lifelong third-generation Girl Scout who's continuing the family tradition with her own 4 daughters. Ida, who is in 5th grade, is a junior Girl Scout, and Marin, who is in 1st grade, is a Daisy Girl Scout. Julia is the co-leader for both troops. Cecily and Laurel, Julia's 2 youngest daughters, will join the ranks when old enough. One of the core values of the Girl Scouts is civic engagement, teaching girls how government works, guiding them to become community leaders, and preparing them to be the voters of tomorrow. So for Julia, there was a natural alignment between the Girl Scouts and the work of the League of Women Voters, which led to the troops' participation in the State League's ratification parade on the square in June 2019. This sparked the troop members' interest to learn more and eventually led to a joint project with the Voter Service Committee this fall. To start, Julia led the troop in learning about the importance of voting. Then the girls decorated postcards with a simple voting message encouraging early registration and early voting. The postcards were enclosed in hand-addressed envelopes which read, "To the grown-ups at." The girls used proceeds earned from cookie sales to pay for postage and supplies. The Voter Services Committee supplied printed flyers with detailed voting information and helped identify apartment complexes where 500 postcards were mailed. All this was done during the pandemic, which meant the girls worked individually at home, gathering for multiple virtual sessions or for socially distanced work outdoors. Today, we want to honor Julia with the Outstanding Voter Service Award for her exemplary service to the community by promoting enthusiasm for civic engagement among Girl Scout Junior Troop 1477 and Daisy Troop 1952, by organizing a voter outreach activity to inform inform 500 apartment residents about voter registration and early voting, and by producing a video about the project that informs and inspires others. And now, we'd like to introduce you to the girls.
Hey Girl Scouts, you know voting is important. The people adults elect represent us and make the laws that affect everything we do. We can make a difference by helping other people vote. Here's a few ways you and your troop can get out and vote. You can make homemade signs like this one to hang around your house and your neighbors' houses. Just remember to ask first. Put up posters in stores and apartment buildings and the community. Decorate your car windows, encouraging others to vote. Encourage your parents to post links with voter information on their social media pages. Remember, accurate, up-to-date info is important. So point others to official resources such as your city clerk's office website or your official state website. Encourage your family members to register voters and help out at polls. You can help around the house to make up for the time. If you're old enough, you can babysit for neighbors so they can help at the polls. And also your family can volunteer for voter education organizations to make calls, send text messages, and send flyers. Send.
You can mail cards to encourage people to vote like our troop did.
We worked with the League of Women Voters to identify areas with low voter turnout. We hand-addressed homemade cards and put in flyers with voter registration information. We made a comic out of toys to encourage early registration, but you can dream up your own fun ideas.
Here's something every Girl Scout can easily do. Call up your family and friends and remind them to vote.
Call your family and friends and remind them to vote. Call your family and friends and remind them to vote. Call your family and friends to remind them to vote.
But it's not just about presidents. There are senators, reps, and local races. Sometimes there's even more than one election in a year, so it's important to remind people about all of them.
Finally, make a promise to yourself that when you grow up, you will vote in every election.
Well, that's it. Every vote matters, so have fun reaching out to others.
Hi, Aunt Kayla. Have you voted yet? No? Well, you should, because your vote matters.
That was such a wonderful story. Julia, thank you so much for your contributions. Would you like to say a few words?
Sure. I would just really like to say thank you so much to the League of Women Voters in Dane County and for all of their tremendous work to engage voters in our area, and particularly for taking the time to reach out to Girl Scouts in our area and being involved in several different programs and really making an impact and being visible so that our girls could be introduced to those ideas and launch off that enthusiasm to create a project like this. So we really appreciate your efforts and are honored to get to be a part of them.
Well, we appreciate your efforts as well. And again, many thanks to you and to your Girl Scouts and future League members, Julia. Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, congratulations, Julia Pooler, the winner of the Outstanding Voter Service Award from the Dane County League of Women Voters. And way to go, Girl Scouts. And let me remind you to make a plan to vote on April 6th. So thanks to our panel. It was a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate all of your time. It was great. So thank you so much. The next Virtual Issues Forum will be What's Ahead? Financing Our Energy Future on April 13th at 7 p.m. And you can register for that on the website. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.